Olivia Carter had always been a firm believer in the little things. The small, simple gestures that turned an ordinary relationship into something truly special. She and Jack had been married for 6 years, and while their love wasn't the kind you read about in romance novels, it was steady, strong, and filled with a quiet devotion that only deepened with time. Jack wasn't the kind of man who made grand romantic gestures. There were no surprise vacations or extravagant gifts. He didn't bring home flowers just because or write long, poetic love letters. But he showed his love in other ways. He always made sure her car had a full tank of gas before she needed it. He made her coffee just the way she liked it, even though he never drank it himself. He would instinctively reach for her hand in the middle of the night, even in his sleep. That was the kind of love they had. Simple, steady, safe. At least, that's what she thought. Jack worked long hours at a prestigious law firm downtown. His job was demanding, grueling even, but he was good at it. Really good. He had a sharp mind and a relentless work ethic, which meant he often brought cases home with him, spending late nights hunched over legal briefs at their kitchen table. It wasn't unusual for him to walk through the front door at 9, sometimes even 10 o'clock at night, looking exhausted but always greeting her with a small, tired smile. On some nights, he would sink onto the couch with a deep sigh, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension. Olivia would sit beside him, resting her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart as he absently ran his fingers through her hair. "I swear, they're trying to kill me in that office," he'd joke, his voice laced with fatigue. "Not if I kill you first," she'd tease back, nudging his side playfully. He would laugh, deep and genuine. And just like that, the stress of his job would melt away, even if only for a little while. It had become their routine, a quiet, comforting rhythm. She didn't mind his long hours. She understood, or at least, she had told herself she did. As Valentine's Day approached, Olivia found herself wanting to do something special for Jack. Not a fancy dinner or an expensive gift. He would just tell her not to spend money on something unnecessary. Instead, she decided to do something simple, something meaningful. A letter. Not just any letter, but a deeply personal, heartfelt message. A reminder of their journey together, of all the small moments that had built their love into what it was today. She spent an entire evening curled up on the couch, a warm blanket draped over her legs, a glass of wine in one hand, and a pen in the other. She wanted the words to be perfect. She started with their first meeting, the awkward, fumbling introduction at a mutual friend's party. Jack had spilled his drink on her. She had laughed it off, but he had been mortified, apologizing at least a dozen times before finally blurting out, "Can I at least buy you another drink so I don't feel like a complete idiot?" She had said yes, and the rest, as they say, was history. She wrote about their late-night conversations, the kind that stretched into the early morning hours, where they talked about everything and nothing at the same time. She wrote about the road trips, the lazy Sundays, the inside jokes that made no sense to anyone but them. She wrote about how proud she was of him, how much she admired the way he worked so hard, even when it drained him. She told him that no matter how exhausting his job got, no matter how many late nights he spent at the office, he would always have a home to come back to. A place where he could just be Jack, not a lawyer, not a professional, not someone who had always have a right answer. Just Jack. Her Jack. By the time she finished, she felt a warm sense of satisfaction. She carefully folded the letter, slipping it into a soft pink envelope, sealing it with a kiss before tucking it into her purse. Tomorrow morning, she would drop it off at his office. She imagined the surprise on his face when he saw it. She pictured him unfolding the letter at his desk, reading her words with a soft smile. Maybe he would send her a text afterward, telling her how much it meant to him. Maybe he would call her. Maybe, if she was lucky, he would even write back. But no matter what, she knew it would brighten his day. That's all she wanted. The next morning, Olivia left the house a little earlier than usual. Jack had already gone. He was always out the door before the sun was even up, but that worked in her favor. She made her way downtown, pulling up in front of the grand, imposing building that housed Jack's law firm. She had been here before, but never often. It was the kind of place that felt cold and impersonal, all glass walls and sleek, modern furniture. It didn't suit Jack, not really. He was warm, comfortable, not sterile, but he had always said that prestige mattered in his field. Clients wanted to feel like they were in capable, sophisticated hands. That meant marble floors, high ceilings, and soulless decor. She stepped inside, greeted by the friendly receptionist at the front desk. "Hi, Mrs. Carter," the woman said with a warm smile. "Here to see Jack." "Oh no," Olivia replied quickly. "I just wanted to drop something off for him." The receptionist nodded. "You can leave it in the employee mailboxes outside his office. I'll make sure he gets it." "Thanks," Olivia said, returning the smile. She made her way down the hall, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Just as the receptionist had said, a small row of mailboxes stood outside the firm's main offices, each one labeled with a name. She found Jack's, slipping the envelope inside before turning to leave. She didn't linger, didn't even think twice about it. She had no way of knowing, in that moment, that the letter she had just delivered would change everything, that it would unravel the life she thought she knew, that by the next morning, she would wish she had never written it at all. The next morning, Olivia woke up to the soft click of the mail slot opening. It was a familiar sound, one she had heard 100 times before, but this time, something about it felt different. She rolled over, still half asleep, the covers warm and heavy around her. The thought drifted lazily through her mind. Jack must have written back. It was an exciting, almost childish feeling. He had never been the type to write letters, so if he had taken the time to respond, it meant her little Valentine's Day surprise had really touched him. She smiled, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and pushed herself out of bed. The wooden floor was cold under her bare feet as she shuffled toward the front door. The usual stack of mail sat in a neat pile on the entryway floor: bills, coupons, the weekly grocery flyer. And then there it was, a single envelope, resting right on top. Her name was written on the front in Jack's handwriting. She hesitated for just a moment, a small flutter of nervous excitement in her stomach, before picking it up. The envelope was almost identical to the one she had left for him. Same off-white paper, same faintly embossed edges. She turned it over in her hands, running her fingers along the crease before carefully tearing it open. The letter inside was short. At first, it was sweet. "I got your letter. Thank you, my love. It means more to me than you know. You always know how to make me smile. Always." Olivia's heart warmed. Of course, he hadn't written much. He was always more comfortable expressing himself out loud than on paper. But then, she read the next line. "I need you to listen carefully. This is important." Her smile faltered. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the letter. Her stomach twisted, an uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. She kept reading. "I don't know who has been coming home to you every night, but it isn't me." The room suddenly felt colder. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind scrambled for an explanation, but nothing made sense. She stared at the words, reading them over and over again, as if by doing so, they might somehow change. "I haven't left the office in months. I don't know how. I don't know what's happened, but something is pretending to be me." A shudder ran through her, sharp and immediate. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered the letter. It had to be a joke, a prank. Maybe one of Jack's colleagues had found her letter and decided to mess with her. Maybe Jack himself was playing some elaborate trick on her. But that wasn't like him. Jack had a dry sense of humor, sure, but he wasn't cruel. And there was something about the way the words were written, something about the urgency, the sheer desperation of them, that made her stomach churn. She picked the letter back up, scanning it again, searching for any sign that it was fake. The handwriting was Jack's. She knew it, as well as her own. She had watched him jot down grocery lists, scribble quick notes in the margins of legal briefs. Every loop, every curve of the letters, it was his. But the message was impossible. Olivia swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. Her thoughts raced. She had seen Jack last night. He had come home, just like he always did. He had kissed her forehead, loosened his tie, and settled onto the couch while she made dinner. They had eaten together. They had talked. She had fallen asleep beside him. So, How could he be claiming he hadn't been home in months? It didn't make sense. Unless. She shook her head, trying to chase away the ridiculous thought forming at the edges of her mind. There had to be an explanation. There had to be. She forced a laugh. Too sharp, too brittle. This was absurd. Completely ridiculous. She was letting her imagination run wild. Still, a cold unease settled deep in her bones, refusing to leave. She turned on a coffee maker, trying to distract herself with routine. As the rich aroma filled the kitchen, she went through the motions, grabbing her favorite mug, pouring in a splash of cream, stirring absent-mindedly. But her mind kept replaying the letter's words. She glanced toward the living room. Jack was still asleep in their bed. Or at least someone was. She shook her head, cursing herself for even thinking that way. This was Jack. Her Jack. Of course it was. But then, a memory surfaced. Something small. Something she might have brushed off any other day. Last night, when she had kissed him goodnight, his skin had been cold. Not ice cold. Not unnatural, just cooler than usual. She had assumed it was because he had just walked in from outside. But now, in the early morning light, the thought made her pulse quicken. And there was something else. Something so minor, she hadn't even registered it at the time. He hadn't said goodnight. Jack always said goodnight. It was part of their routine, something so ingrained in their relationship that it felt as natural as breathing. But last night, when she had whispered the words to him, he had just smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. She had dismissed it then. Now, it sent a chill down her spine. Her gaze drifted back to the letter, still clutched tightly in her hands. She didn't know why, but suddenly, she had the overwhelming urge to hide it. She grabbed her purse and slipped the letter inside, burying it beneath her wallet. As she did, she heard the faint creak of the bedroom door opening. Footsteps. Slow, measured. She took a steadying breath and turned. Jack stood in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his dark hair mussed from sleep. "Morning," he murmured, voice still thick with drowsiness. She forced a smile, pushing down the gnawing feeling of unease. "Morning." He crossed the room, pressing a quick kiss to her temple before reaching for a mug. She watched him carefully. His movements were the same. The way he reached for the sugar, the way he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. It was all perfectly normal. And yet, something fell off. She couldn't place it, couldn't explain it, but it was there. A tension in the air, a sense of wrongness that made her skin prickle. Jack took a sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim of the mug. "You okay?" Her heart pounded. She forced a laugh, shaking her head. "Yeah, just spaced out for a second." He smiled, but there was something about that smile. Something studied, calculated, like he was mimicking an expression he had seen before. Like he knew he was being watched. Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She needed to figure out what was going on, and she needed to do it fast. Olivia wanted to shake the feeling. She wanted to believe she was being ridiculous. That stress, exhaustion, or maybe even an overactive imagination had planted this nagging thought in her head. But she couldn't ignore the weight pressing down on her chest. Something felt wrong. Something was wrong. Jack, or the man who looked like Jack, was moving through the house like he always did. He grabbed his briefcase, kissed her on the cheek, and left for work with a casual, "See you tonight." Everything about the moment should have reassured her, but it didn't. The second the front door clicked shut, Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned back to the kitchen table, where the letter sat hidden inside her purse. She pulled it out, reading Jack's words again. "I haven't left the office in months. I don't know how. I don't know what's happened. But something is pretending to be me." A deep chill ran through her. It wasn't a joke. She was sure of it now. But that meant she'd spent the last few weeks sleeping next to something else. Something that wasn't her husband. She rubbed her temples, forcing herself to think. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe Jack had suffered some kind of breakdown at work. Maybe he had been overworked, lost track of time, and somehow believed he hadn't been home in months. Or maybe, no. She shut her eyes tightly, refusing to go down that road. She needed proof. If something was wrong, she had to know for sure. And that meant paying close attention, watching for the cracks. And if there was something else living in her home, She needed to find out what it wanted. That night, she pretended nothing had changed. She smiled at Jack when he walked through the door. She asked him about his day. She made dinner as usual, but she was watching him, really watching him, looking for anything that seemed different, anything that didn't match the man she had loved for 6 years. And, slowly, she started to see it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. The way he held his fork. Jack had always been left-handed, but tonight, he ate with his right. The way he chewed his food, methodical, almost calculated, like he was mimicking an action rather than doing it naturally. And then, the inside joke. It slipped out naturally, something she would have said any other night, something that should have made Jack laugh. Instead, he just smiled. A small, polite smile, but not the real one. Not the kind that made his dimples crease or the corners of his eyes crinkle. It was empty. A copy. She forced herself to keep eating, to keep talking, to pretend like she wasn't unraveling inside. After dinner, she excused herself to take a shower. She needed a moment alone. Steam filled the small bathroom as she turned on the hot water, stepping under the stream, letting it scald her skin. Her mind raced. Was it possible that Jack wasn't Jack? She thought back to all the small, unexplainable moments. The coldness of his skin, the way he hesitated before answering simple questions, the things he should have known but didn't. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, despite the heat of the water. Maybe she was losing it. Maybe she was imagining things. But the feeling of wrongness sat heavy in her chest, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. She emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, steam curling behind her. Jack was sitting on the bed, reading something on his phone. He glanced up and smiled. "You took your time," he teased. Olivia forced a chuckle, walking to the dresser to grab her night clothes. But she could feel his eyes on her, watching, studying, like he was memorizing her movements. She turned slightly, testing him. "Hey, you didn't leave me a love letter back?" she asked, keeping her voice light, teasing. Jack raised an eyebrow. Love letter. Olivia's stomach dropped. He should have known. She had left him a letter. He should have said something about it. Even if he hadn't written back, he should have at least acknowledged it. But instead, he hesitated. Then, too quickly, he smiled. "Oh yeah," he said smoothly. "Sorry, I meant to say something. That was really sweet." The words were too perfect, like he was pulling them from a script. A cold sweat broke out along the back of her neck. He was lying. She knew it with every fiber of her being. Jack had never been a good liar. If this was Jack, if this was really her husband, he would have fumbled, given himself away. But this thing, it adapted. It corrected itself too fast. It was trying to act human, trying to act like him. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Well," she said lightly, turning away. "I'm glad you liked it." She needed to get out of this room, out of this house, away from whatever was in front of her. The next morning, Olivia made up her mind. She needed to see for herself. She needed proof. She went through her routine as usual, woke up before Jack, brewed the coffee, kissed him on the cheek, and told him she had a long day ahead. He smiled at her like always. A perfect smile. Too perfect. And as she walked out the door, gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white, she didn't look back. She drove the same way she always did, took the same turns, followed the same routine, just in case he was watching. But once she was out of sight of the house, she turned in the opposite direction. She wasn't going to work. She was going to Jack's office, to his real office, to find out if her husband had ever really come home. She parked outside the law firm, gripping the steering wheel, her pulse hammering against her ribs. What was she expecting? To walk inside and find Jack sitting at his desk? To see him laughing with his coworkers? To confirm that everything had been some elaborate mistake? Or was she about to prove her worst fear, that the man living in her house wasn't her husband? She took a deep breath, then stepped out of the car. As she walked through the doors, the receptionist looked up and smiled. "Hi, Mrs. Carter," she said politely. Olivia forced a smile. "I'm just dropping by to see my husband." The receptionist's brow furrowed slightly. She hesitated. Then, in a voice too soft, too gentle, she said, "I'm sorry, but Jack hasn't been here in weeks." Olivia's world tilted. The floor felt like it was slipping out from under her. Her breath stalled in her throat. She tried to speak, but the words stuck. The receptionist was still talking, still explaining something, but Olivia didn't hear any of it. Because in that moment, she knew Jack had never come home. The thing in her house, the thing sleeping beside her, wasn't her husband. Olivia stood frozen in front of the receptionist's desk, her mind struggling to process the words she had just heard. Jack hasn't been here in weeks. She felt her breath stall in her throat. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse as a numb, dizzying sensation crept through her limbs. It didn't make sense. Jack had been coming home every night. He had kissed her good morning. He had eaten dinner with her. She had fallen asleep beside him, hadn't she? The receptionist was still talking, something about how they had assumed Jack had taken a leave of absence, how his things were still in his office, untouched. But Olivia barely heard any of it. Her mind was spinning, her pulse hammering against her ribs like a drumbeat of terror. Slowly, she found her voice. "Can I see his office?" The receptionist hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty passed across her face. Then she nodded. "This way." The walk down the hallway felt surreal. The office was bright and modern, full of the usual buzz of activity. Colleagues typing at their computers, quiet conversations drifting through the air. Everything seemed normal, completely detached from the fact that her world was crumbling. They stopped in front of a door. A storage room. The receptionist hesitated again before twisting the knob. As the door swung open, Olivia's stomach turned. Jack's desk sat untouched. His work bag was on the chair, the straps slightly askew, like he had tossed it there, intending to pick it up again soon. His coat hung neatly on the rack, not a speck of dust on it. And then, on the desk, was a single sheet of paper. Her name was written across the top. A chill ran down her spine. She knew it was his handwriting before she even picked it up. Her hands shook as she unfolded the note. She forced herself to read. "If you're reading this, I'm still here. Something else took my place. It knows everything I know. It acts like me, but it isn't me." Her throat tightened. "It's afraid of fire." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She gripped the letter, her breath shallow, her mind screaming at her to run. Jack was alive, but he had never come home. The thing she had been living with, eating with, sleeping beside, wasn't Jack. And now, it knew she was onto it. She needed to leave. Now. She turned on her heel and rushed out of the office, past the receptionist's confused expression, past the rows of desks, and the hum of normality that felt completely foreign now. She practically ran to her car, fumbling with her keys, heart pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. The second she was inside, she locked the doors. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, shaking. Her mind raced. How long had it been there? How had she not noticed? And most importantly, what did it want? She thought of the way it watched her at dinner, the way it hesitated before answering simple questions, like it was piecing together the right response, the way it smiled, the way it touched her, mimicking Jack, perfectly, too perfectly. She sucked in a breath, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't go home. Not yet. Not until she had a plan. She reached for her phone, fingers fumbling as she pulled up her contacts. Jack's number stared back at her. A lump formed in her throat. If he was still alive, if he was really trapped somewhere, would he even answer? Would she hear his voice, his real voice? She pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Her breath caught as it clicked. Static filled the line, a garbled, broken sound. Then, Olivia. Her heart clenched. It was him. It was Jack. But his voice was hoarse, weak, like he hadn't spoken in days. "Oh my God," she gasped. "Jack, where are you?" More static. A cough. Then, "It knows. It knows you found the letter." A wave of nausea rolled through her. Her stomach twisted. "What is it?" she whispered, gripping the phone tighter. Silence. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a breath, "It's coming." The line went dead. Olivia sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mind blank with terror. Then, a tap on her window. She jerked so hard she nearly dropped the phone. Her head whipped toward the sound, and her blood turned to ice. "Jack!" standing outside her car, smiling. He tilted his head, tapping his fingers against the glass in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like he knew exactly what she had just heard. Her breath caught in her throat. She had parked far from the entrance. There was no way he should have known she was out here. No way he should have followed her. No way he could have known. And yet, here he was, his eyes locked on hers, his smile widening. Too wide. She forced herself to move, to breathe, to think. She fumbled with the keys, shoving them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Jack, or whatever it was, didn't react. It just stood there, smiling, watching. She threw the car into reverse, tires screeching against the pavement as she backed out of the space. And still it didn't move, just watched. As she sped out of the parking lot, she caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. Jack, standing there, perfectly still, perfectly calm. And then, a slow, deliberate wave, as if it already knew. She had nowhere else to go. She would have to come home eventually. Olivia didn't know how long she drove. Her mind was racing, her body trembling with leftover adrenaline. She needed to think. She needed a plan. Jack's words echoed in her head. It's afraid of fire. Fire. She swallowed, gripping the steering wheel. Could she do it? Could she burn it? And if she did, would that bring Jack back? She sucked in a shaky breath, trying to push down the rising panic in her chest. It didn't matter. She had no choice. She wasn't going to let it win. Slowly, she turned the car around. She was going back home, back to it. And this time, she wouldn't be afraid. She was going to burn it alive. The drive back home felt like it stretched for hours, even though it was only minutes. Olivia's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded, not just from fear, but from determination. She had spent days living in the same house as that thing, eating with it, sleeping beside it, believing it was her husband. Now, she knew the truth, and she wasn't going to let it fool her again. Jack's final words on the phone echoed in her head. It's afraid of fire. Fire. That was the key. That was how she was going to end this. She forced herself to take slow, measured breaths. She couldn't afford to panic now. She needed to think, to plan, to act like she didn't know. Because if it suspected even for a second that she had figured it out, it would strike first. She pulled into the driveway, forcing her expression into something neutral. She couldn't hesitate, couldn't let it see her fear. She stepped out of the car, grabbing the grocery bag she had picked up as a cover. Her hands trembled as she walked to the front door. The house loomed ahead, dark against the night sky. For a split second, she considered running, driving away and never looking back. But that wasn't an option. Not while Jack was still out there, somewhere. Not while this thing was still pretending to be him. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air felt thick, heavy, like the house itself knew what was about to happen. And there it was, sitting in the living room, waiting. Jack, or rather, the thing wearing his face, was reclined on the couch, one arm draped lazily over the backrest. He turned his head when she entered, smiling. "Hey," he said casually. "I was wondering where you ran off to." Olivia forced a small laugh, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. "Just needed to clear my head," she lied smoothly. "Long day." The thing studied her. She could feel its eyes scanning her, assessing her. Could it tell? Could it sense that she knew? She turned away quickly, grabbing a bottle of whiskey from the counter. Jack had always kept it there, for guests or the rare nights when he actually allowed himself to unwind. Tonight, it was for something else entirely. She unscrewed the cap, pretending to pour herself a drink. Behind her, she could feel it watching. "You okay?" it asked, voice lined with fake concern. She smiled over her shoulder. "Yeah, just needed a drink." She turned the bottle over and let the whiskey spill onto the floor. A casual accident, a clumsy, unbothered spill. She forced herself to act normal. She crouched down, pretending to clean it, but her fingers stayed curled around the glass bottle, gripping it tightly. A few more seconds, just a little longer. "Oops," she muttered. She reached into her pocket, felt the cool, familiar shape of the lighter. "It knows. It knows you found the letter." Jack's voice echoed in her head, and her pulse spiked. She stood slowly and struck the lighter. The small flame flickered to life, and the thing stiffened. A subtle reaction, barely noticeable. But Olivia noticed. Her fingers tightened around the bottle. "Olivia," the thing said, and this time its voice had changed. The casual, smooth tone was gone. There was something else underneath it now. Something wrong. She locked eyes with it, and she saw it. For the first time, she truly saw it. Something inhuman was lurking behind Jack's familiar features. It was in the way his pupils dilated too much, swallowing the brown of his irises. In the way his body held itself too still, like it was just remembering how humans moved. In the way his lips curled too wide when he smiled, stretching his skin in a way that wasn't natural. "Put that out," it said. She didn't. Instead, she let the whiskey-soaked towel in her hand drift toward the flame. And then, she dropped it. The fire caught instantly. A bright, hungry blaze. It raced across the wooden floor, lapping up the alcohol, crawling toward it. The thing that looked like Jack screamed. Not in pain, not in fear, but in rage. The sound was inhuman. It wasn't Jack's voice anymore. It was something deeper, something guttural, something that belonged to something older than language itself. The thing staggered back, its movements jerky, no longer fluid. Olivia took a step forward, her own fear replaced by pure adrenaline. "You're not him," she whispered. The thing's eyes flashed. "You don't understand what you're doing," it growled. Its voice warped, flickering between Jack's tone and something else. Something monstrous. Olivia's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "Where is he?" she demanded. "Where's my husband?" The thing bared its teeth. The fire was spreading now, crawling up the walls, licking at the furniture. "You think this will fix anything?" it hissed. "You think you can take him back?" It took a step toward her, but the flames surged higher, cutting it off. It let out another shriek, its body convulsing as the heat bore down on it. Then, something inside of it broke. Its skin peeled away, revealing something dark beneath. Something not human. Its features twisted and cracked, shattering like porcelain. And then, it lunged. Olivia dove back, hitting the floor hard as the creature's arm whipped toward her, missing her face by inches. Heat pulsed around them. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. The house was collapsing. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her limbs. She had to get out. Now. The front door. It was only a few steps away. She ran. The fire roared behind her, a deafening howl of destruction. The thing, it was still screaming, its voice twisting into something raw and alien, something that didn't belong in this world. She threw herself through the doorway, hitting the pavement outside. The cold air stung her lungs as she gasped for breath. And then, the house caved in. Flames exploded through the structure, swallowing it whole. And for a moment, everything was silent. Nothing but the crackling of burning wood. Nothing but the sound of destruction. Nothing but the end. And then, a movement. A shadow in the fire. Her breath stalled. A figure stumbled forward. Burned. Weak. Covered in soot. Her heart stopped. Jack. And then, she saw his eyes. Brown. Warm. And for the first time in weeks, she knew. It was really him. Her real husband. Tears burned her cheeks as she ran to him. He collapsed against her, his body shaking, his breath ragged. She clutched him, sobbing into his shoulder, her hands desperate to feel something real. Something human. "You came back," she whispered. His voice was hoarse, barely above a breath. "Yeah," he rasped, a weak smile. "Yeah, I did." The fire roared behind them, a living, breathing monster consuming their home. But Olivia didn't care. All she cared about was the man in her arms. Jack. Her real Jack. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, his breath ragged against her neck. He was real. He was back. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched him tighter, her heart pounding against his chest. For weeks, she had lived in fear. For weeks, she had shared a home with something that wasn't him. And now, after everything, after the fire, after the terror, she had him back. She could hardly believe it. She pulled back slightly, running trembling fingers through his soot-covered hair. His face was dirty, streaked with ash and sweat, but his eyes, those warm brown eyes, were unmistakably his. Not empty. Not cold. Not like the thing that had been pretending to be him. "Jack," she whispered, searching his face, almost afraid he would disappear if she blinked. He smiled, a small, tired smile. "Yeah," he rasped. "It's me." A sob broke from her lips. She didn't care that they were sitting on the cold pavement, didn't care that the fire department would be arriving any second. She had him back, and nothing else mattered. But the moment of relief didn't last long, because Jack's expression shifted. The exhaustion in his eyes deepened, and his body, weak, trembling, swayed. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Panic flared in Olivia's chest. "Jack," she said quickly, gripping his shoulders. He didn't respond right away. His eyelids fluttered, as if he was struggling to stay conscious. Her grip tightened. "No, no, no, stay with me." His lips parted. A whisper, so soft, she almost didn't hear it. Cold. Her heart clenched. He was in shock. She had to get him help. Now. She looked up, frantically scanning the street. The neighbors had come outside, drawn by the towering flames. Someone was already calling for help. The sirens were coming, but it wasn't fast enough. She had to keep him awake. She shook him slightly. "Jack, talk to me," she pleaded. His eyes barely focused on her. "Is it gone?" She swallowed hard, glancing over her shoulder at the house. The fire had swallowed everything. The thing inside, it had to be dead, hadn't it? She turned back to Jack, nodding quickly. "Yes, it's gone," she said, though the words felt fragile, breakable. His body sagged with relief. But then, his fingers curled weakly around her wrist. His grip was cold, too cold. A new kind of fear slithered into her chest. "Jack." He opened his mouth, but his voice wasn't his anymore. It was barely a whisper, hoarse, hollow, and full of something that made her blood freeze. Not all of it. A chill shot down Olivia's spine. She stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. "What?" she whispered. Jack's eyelids fluttered again, his grip tightening ever so slightly on her wrist. His fingers were trembling, his skin cooler than before. "Not all of it," he repeated, barely audible. Her pulse pounded against her skull. The fire had destroyed it. It had burned. She had watched it die, hadn't she? The memory of the creature's final screams echoed in her ears. The way its skin had peeled away, revealing something dark and shapeless underneath. The way it had lunged for her, even as the flames devoured it. What if it hadn't died? What if it had left something behind? Or worse, what if it had never really needed the body at all? The thought struck her like a slap. It had worn Jack's face, but that hadn't been its true form. Maybe it had always been something else. Something that didn't need a body. Something that could slip into another one. Her breath hitched. She looked down at Jack, panic clawing at her ribs. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused. No, 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 no. He was Jack. He was real. She refused to believe it had touched him, that it had taken anything from him. But as the sirens grew closer, drowning out her pounding heart, she realized. She didn't know for sure. The paramedics arrived within minutes. Jack was lifted onto a stretcher, oxygen mask placed over his face, voices moving fast and sharp around her. Olivia hovered close, answering their questions in a daze. Yes, the fire had been accidental. Yes, she had gotten out in time. Yes, Jack had been inside, trapped, but she had pulled him out. She forced herself to lie, because how could she tell the truth? How could she say that her husband had been missing for weeks? That something had been wearing his face, mimicking his voice, his movements? That she had burned their house down because she wasn't sure if what she had been living with was even human? She couldn't, so she didn't. She rode in the ambulance beside him, her hands gripping his. He was still so cold, too cold, even under the thick blankets the paramedics had wrapped around him, even as warm air pumped through the vehicle. Her stomach twisted. She squeezed his fingers. "Jack," she whispered. His eyelids fluttered again, and then he looked at her, really looked at her. Her heart nearly stopped. His eyes, they were the same color, the same deep brown, but something inside them fell off, just for a second, just for a flicker of a moment, like something else was looking back at her. Then he blinked, and it was gone, like it had never been there at all. The hospital was bright, sterile. Jack was rushed into the emergency room, nurses and doctors speaking in hushed tones. Smoke inhalation, minor burns, dehydration, no serious injuries. A miracle. Olivia sat beside his bed, her fingers tangled in his. Hours passed. He finally opened his eyes, and the first thing he said was, "Hey." His voice was weak, but it was his. A relief so strong it made her dizzy washed over her. She let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her damp cheeks. "Hey yourself," she murmured. His lips curved into a small, tired smile. "You look like hell." She huffed out a breathless laugh, her heart twisting. "So do you." Jack chuckled, then winced. Olivia reached for him immediately, but he waved her off weakly. "I'm okay," he whispered. She swallowed hard, and then, because she had to ask, "Do you remember anything?" A flicker of something passed over his face. He hesitated. Her stomach turned. Then, "No," he said, "nothing." Her heart stuttered. She studied his face, searching for any hint of a lie, any sign that he wasn't telling the truth. But he just smiled at her and squeezed her hand. For the first time in weeks, she felt warm, felt safe, felt like she had her husband back. And yet, deep in the pit of her stomach, a whisper of doubt remained, because something inside her told her that it wasn't over, that something had survived, that it had left a piece of itself behind, and that one day, it would come back,